Hello, my name's Claire. For years, I thought distance from my family was just life pulling us apart. But the truth? They built the walls themselves, brick by brick, feeding me lies, draining my inheritance, and selling the only home I'd ever known. All while smiling to my face. I uncovered it piece by piece, but one question still keeps me awake at night. How long had they been planning it? The morning started the same as most others in Cedar Hollow, with the faint hum of cicadas drifting through the lace curtains and the smell of fresh coffee curling in the air. I stood at the kitchen counter, cradling my favorite chipped mug in both hands, watching the golden light spread across the fields beyond my window. The radio murmured in the background a farm report about the upcoming county fair, and for a moment everything felt steady, predictable. Then the phone rang. It was Aunt Marlene, her voice lilting but edged with something I couldn't quite place. We traded a few pleasantries before she slipped in the comment. "I heard from your dad. You're just passing time at that clinic?" Just passing time. Her words landed soft, but the sting was immediate. She said it like she was remarking on the weather, harmless, casual. But I heard the undertone, that quiet judgment wrapped in concern. I forced a small laugh, answered politely, and steered the conversation elsewhere, though my knuckles tightened around the receiver. After we hung up, the quiet of the kitchen felt different, heavier somehow. I grabbed the folder of medical supply invoices I'd promised to drop off with Dad and stepped out into the late summer morning. Dad's house was just next door, the one I grew up in. The porch still creaked in the same spot, the screen door still whined on its hinges. Inside, he sat at the table, reading the paper, coffee in hand. Without looking up, he said, "Marlene says you're restless. Maybe it's time you settle into something real." Something real. I thought of my years in the Air Force, the desert heat, the sharp smell of antiseptic, the weight of a life in my hands while sand and rotor wash swirled around me. Real didn't begin to cover it. But I swallowed the words, slid the folder across the table, and gave a small nod. He went back to reading, unaware of the knot forming in my chest. On my way to the car, Mrs. Turner waved me down from her front yard. Her hair was wrapped in a floral scarf, and she smiled wide, but her words were laced with the same syrupy tone I'd heard from Marlene. "Heard a little talk about you slowing down lately. Guess it's nice to take it easy for a while, huh?" I returned her smile, said something about enjoying the peace, and kept walking. Inside, my thoughts weren't nearly as sweet. In a town like ours, whispers traveled faster than summer storms. Back in my own kitchen, I poured another cup of coffee and sat by the window. The cicadas droned on, their rhythm steady, almost mocking in its constancy. My gaze drifted to the small shadow box on the wall, a folded flag, a few commendation medals, and a photo of me in uniform with my team. I thought of the lives I'd helped save, the ones I'd lost, and how none of that seemed to count here. I wrapped my hands around the mug, the warmth seeping into my skin, and felt something stir deep inside. I wouldn't let myself be reduced to a footnote in the local gossip chain, not after everything I'd done and everything I still had left to do. I didn't know it then, but that morning's phone call was the first crack in a dam I thought was unshakable. The clinic is quietest after lunch. The phones ring in short, polite bursts, then rest. The air conditioner hums the same steady note it has hummed every summer since I moved back to Cedar Hollow. I wash my hands, slide on fresh gloves, and pull the next chart from the stack. Mr. Carter is due in 20 minutes for his blood pressure check and a gentle scolding about salt. Routine is a mercy. It gives the mind a place to set down its heavier bags. While I double-check dosages, yesterday presses in around the edges. Marlene's voice. Dad's offhand verdict about something real. I push it aside, focus on the soft green of the chart and the neat columns I've kept since spring. My handwriting is small, careful. It calms me to see it lined up in a row, as tidy as a well-made bed. A knuckle taps my open door. "Hey, Avon?" Becky leans in, ponytail high, eyebrows lifted. "There's a gentleman here asking for you by name. No appointment." I glance at the waiting room through the glass panel. A man stands near the fish tank, hands clasped in front of him. Shirt sleeves rolled, tie loosened, the kind of posture that says he's comfortable wherever he happens to be. He lifts his eyes and, as if he knew the exact moment to look, meets mine. Send him back, I say, surprised at myself. Curiosity can be a poor chaperone, but today it wins. He steps into my office with a brief, quiet smile. Up close, he looks mid-40s, hair going silver at the temples, the kind of face that would vanish in a crowd until you remembered the eyes. "Ms. Callahan," he says. "Thank you for seeing me. My name is Evan Reed." "We're a small clinic, Mr. Reed," I say, motioning to the chair. "People usually come here because something aches." He sits without fuss. Something does, just not the kind we can put a bandage on. I wait. A little silence is often the best first treatment. He glances around the room, the diplomas, the framed photos of old teammates, the folded flag in the corner shadow box I keep where it won't invite questions. "You served," he says, not asking. "Air Force. Medic." The word lifts the hair on my arms. I keep my voice even. "I did. Bagram, among other places." He says the airbase the way only someone who has stood on its gravel would. "You were on a night shift when a convoy came in hot, power flickered, generators coughed. The team improvised triage by headlamp. A young tech managed a chest seal with one hand while steadying a light with the other. People remember competence. They remembered you." I have told no one in Cedar Hollow about that night. My mind does what it learned to do long ago. It takes inventory. He knows the place. He knows the tempo. But he adds nothing that compromises anyone. He is careful. That makes me more cautious, not less. "What do you want, Mr. Reed?" He folds his hands. "Two things. To tell you that your name has come up in a matter I'm looking into, and to ask if you'd be willing to talk about a few events from that year." "We don't talk about patients," I say. "Not names, not conditions, not then, not now." "I'm not asking you to," he replies. "This isn't medical, it's administrative, let's say, a sequence of decisions that affected people long after they came home. Some of those people live in towns like this. Some of the decisions were made by folks who never left the capital. He lets that hang between us. I hear the air conditioner kick to a higher gear. In the waiting room, a child laughs at the fish tank bubbles. "You came all the way to Cedar Hollow to tell me I was competent," I say. "I came because people who were there trust you," he says. "And because, from what I gather, you prefer very little fuss and a lot of facts." Becky knocks again, softer this time. "Sorry, Avon, Mr. Carter's here a little early. He says he wants to beat the thunderclouds." I nod, then to Reed, "Give me 10 minutes. I should send him away. I should put this conversation on a polite shelf and let dust gather on it." Instead, I step into exam 2 and wrap a cuff around a sun-leathered arm while my mind replays the word administrative like a stone in a tumbler. Mr. Carter jokes about the fair. He asks if I'm entering my peach cobbler this year. I promise to think about it and ask about his pills. He tells me his daughter says he's stubborn. I tell him stubbornness kept his generation standing through more than one hard season. His numbers look better. I praise him, mark the chart, and when I walk him out, he squeezes my hand with a farmer's gratitude that says more than any speech. When I return, Reed has not moved. He's reading the framed postcard on my wall, the one my mother sent me from a county 2 states over on a summer we didn't have much money but made do with imagination. He turns as I enter, and his expression shifts back to neutral. "I can give you 5 minutes," I say. "It is more than I planned." He takes a thin card from his pocket and lays it on the desk. No agency seal. No government crest, just a name, a number, a small email in black ink. "Call me when you're ready. I'm staying at the motel by the highway for a couple of days." "You didn't use 5 minutes," I say. "I didn't need them," he answers. "I needed to see how you listen." I raise an eyebrow. And you listen like someone who knows that words can save lives. Or ruin them. Becky's voice carries from the front, a quick apology to someone, the rustle of paper bags. Reed stands. "One more thing. You may hear a version of me being here before you hear mine. Small towns produce stories the way orchards produce fruit. If you want to shape the story, call me sooner rather than later. He leaves with that, light on his feet for a man his size. The door sighs shut. I stare at the card. It looks ordinary enough to be forgettable. I slide it into the middle drawer and close it, as if the act of hiding it might quiet the drum in my chest. The rest of the afternoon passes in the rhythm I know well. A sprained wrist, a rash that turns out to be nothing, a toddler with a fever who recovers the moment I hand him a sticker. I move through the rooms with the calm hands I have earned, but each time I wash them, I see the night Reed described, the glow of a headlamp, the breath I held until a chest rose on its own again. At 5, I lock the front door and turn the sign. The sky has that late summer look it gets here, a flat white that promises heat lightning after dark. Becky waves from her car, calls, "See you tomorrow," and drives off with the radio turned up to a song I don't recognize. I stand on the sidewalk a long moment, listening to the insects sing and the faraway thud of someone stacking hay bales. Cedar Hollow moves at the speed of human hands. It forgives slowly, judges quickly, and remembers what it chooses to. I have tried to be patient with that. I have swallowed more than I said yesterday, and I am still swallowing. I unlock my car, sit with the door open to catch a shy breeze, and take out my phone. The motel number on the card looks like any other number. I dial, then hang up before it rings. I dial again. This time I let it go through. "Reed," he answers. "This is Avon," I say. "I'm not promising anything, but I don't like other people telling my story. If there are facts I need, I'll hear them from you." There's a pause long enough to let me change my mind. "Understood," he says. "Tomorrow morning, 9, there's a booth at Millie's Diner by the window." "Make it 8, I say. If I'm going to open this door, I want to be the one holding the handle. 8 it is. I end the call and rest the phone face down on my thigh. Across the lot, a family loads groceries into a trunk. A girl no more than 6 hugs a bag of peaches to her chest like treasure. Her mother kisses the top of her head. The ordinary grace of it makes my throat ache. When I pull into my driveway, the porch light is already on next door. Dad keeps it that way whether he's home or not, a small beacon that says this street still belongs to him. I park, sit a while, then decide against stopping in. I do not have the energy for a conversation that will end with him saying he is only being practical. I am tired of practicality that shrinks the soul. Inside my kitchen, the air still smells faintly of morning coffee. I wash my mug, set it carefully on the rack, and turn the radio back on. The evening report talks about the fairgrounds setting up booths, about a chance of storms tomorrow. I listen like it's a language from another life. It soothes me anyway. On my table, I place a small notepad and write a list I don't show anyone. Call Reed, pull my old service files, check the lock on the box in the hall closet, bake something for Mr. Carter because kindness is its own medicine. I look at the list, then at my hands. They are steady. I am not a woman who enjoys a fight, but I am a woman who understands the cost of letting other people aim the first punch and the last word. If stories are going to be told about me, they will be told with accuracy. If decisions made years ago are bending the shape of my days, I will trace their lines and decide where to cut. I step out to the back porch as dusk thickens. Fireflies test their lamps above the grass. A train blows a distant horn, long and low. I breathe in the warm air and let it out slowly. Tomorrow will bring answers or more questions. Either way, the next move belongs to me. The sky had turned sullen overnight. Yesterday's bright summer light was gone, replaced by a low lid of gray cloud pressing over Cedar Hollow. I woke to the heavy scent of damp earth drifting through my open window and the cicadas' restless hum sounding sharper in the cool air. By the time I'd made it to the kitchen, the first drops of rain had darkened the porch rail. I pulled out a pen and a scrap of yellow paper, jotting a quick notice for the clinic's bulletin board. Possible heat storms this afternoon. Stay hydrated and check on elderly neighbors. It was habit now, leaving small warnings for people who didn't see trouble coming. But as I stuck the note in my bag, I realized the sky wasn't the only thing carrying yesterday's weight. My father's words, and Aunt Marlene's before them, had worked their way under my skin. A restlessness I hadn't invited was still there, moving around like a splinter I couldn't quite dig out. On my way to pour another cup of coffee, my eyes caught the corner of a picture frame leaning against the counter. An old snapshot, the Polk County Fair, years back. The sun had been so bright that day, the dust in the air had glittered. I could almost hear the tinny music from the carousel, smell the fried dough. In the photo, I'm standing near the livestock pens, wearing jeans and a ball cap, half smiling. Dad's hand is resting on my shoulder. I remember the exact moment it was taken, because just before the shutter clicked, he'd introduced me to his old postal buddies with a laugh. She's just helping out until she figures herself out. I'd laughed too, brushing it off. That was back when I still believed people meant no harm unless they said it sharp. Back when I thought my father's words were simply clumsy, not calculated. Now, years later, that line felt heavier. It sat right beside yesterday's remark about settling into something real, as if they'd been waiting all along to line up. At lunch, I sat behind the reception desk at the clinic, unwrapping my sandwich. The rain had passed, leaving the air sticky, and I was grateful for the hum of the air conditioner. The doorbell chimed and Mrs. Turner bustled in, her floral umbrella dripping on the mat. "Well, aren't you a sight," she said with her usual cheer, placing a paper bag of still warm pastries on the counter. We chatted about the weather, about her nephew's new calf. Then, mid-story, she tilted her head and lowered her voice. "You know, some folks just aren't the type to stick to one thing. Not that there's anything wrong with it." Her eyes flickered in that quick, testing way, waiting to see if I'd bristle. I didn't. I smiled, thanked her for the turnovers, and wished her a good day. But as the door closed behind her, my throat tightened. The words were different, but the rhythm was the same. It was a story about me, one I hadn't told, but somehow everyone seemed to know. 8 years ago, I'd stood on the stage at the St. Louis EMS Academy, cap in hand, my dress blues crisp and perfect. I'd worked harder than I thought I could, fought through night rotations and trauma drills that left my hands shaking. Dad was late. He missed the part where they called my name, where I shook the director's hand. When he finally arrived, he grinned like nothing had been missed and said, "Wearing that uniform for the pictures, huh?" I laughed then, because that's what you do when you don't want to make a scene. I told myself he didn't know how to say he was proud. But standing in my kitchen now, the memory felt different. Not clumsy, not harmless. A pattern. Chief Ross had been there that day, too. He'd clasped my hand in both of his, told me I'd make a fine medic, that the city was lucky to have me. His words had warmed me then. Now they burned a little, standing in contrast to my father's shrug. By late afternoon, the clouds had thickened again, bruising the horizon. I walked home from the clinic with the wind at my back, my mind pulling threads from years apart and tying them together. At my desk, I opened my journal and wrote slowly. It's not that they don't know my worth, it's that they'd rather pretend it's less. I read it twice, the scratch of the pen still fresh in my ears. It was the first time I'd named it, this thing that had followed me from the fairgrounds to the academy stage to my own kitchen table. The first crack of thunder rolled across the hills, long and low. I closed the journal. I wouldn't let them write my story anymore. The first knock came with the wind. I'd been sitting on the couch, legs tucked under me, watching the sky darken over Cedar Hollow. The clouds had been rolling in all afternoon, fat-bellied and slow, and now they'd gathered into something heavy enough to press against the windows. The second knock was louder, sharper. I pushed myself up and crossed the living room, glancing toward the porch. A sheet of rain had just started to fall, the drops slanting in the wind. When I opened the door, Aunt Marlene stood there, her hair plastered to her cheeks, umbrella clutched in one hand like it was barely keeping her afloat. Her bright lipstick was smudged, and there was no trace of her usual half-smile. From the sidewalk, Caleb Rios ambled by with his toolbox, nodding at me before his eyes slid toward Marlene. "Looks like trouble blowing in more ways than one," he said with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. I forced a polite smile back, but my stomach had already tightened. "I need to talk," Marlene said, stepping past me before I'd even said hello. Just for a few minutes. The smell of rain clung to her as she set the umbrella against the wall, water pooling onto the mat. She didn't bother with the usual chatter about the weather or the latest church fundraiser. Instead, she sat down in my armchair like she'd been waiting for me to ask her what was wrong. "What's going on?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. She hesitated, folding her hands in her lap. "Your dad's worried," she began, drawing out the words. "He thinks maybe you're pulling away from the family and some of the choices you've been making." She broke off, glancing at me. "Well, he's afraid they're alienating people." It was the same phrasing I'd heard from Mrs. Turner at the clinic. Too neat, too rehearsed to be coincidence. My pulse ticked faster. "Alienating people?" I repeated, leaning against the arm of the couch. "That's an interesting way to say living my own life." Marlene shifted in the chair. "You know how small towns are. Folks notice when someone changes direction." I thought of the Polk County Fair, of Dad introducing me as just helping out until she figures herself out, of him showing up late to my EMS Academy graduation, making a joke about me wearing the uniform for the pictures. The pattern was there, clear now, in a way it hadn't been then. "Marlene," I said quietly, "this isn't about me changing direction. It's about Dad never accepting the one I chose." She tried to soften her tone. "He just wants what's best for you." But then she slipped. "He's been telling folks you're wasting your years. I think he's just frustrated." The words hit like a gut punch. It wasn't just private criticism anymore. He was shaping how people saw me. The unease from yesterday hardened into something sharper. Lightning flared outside, lighting the room for a heartbeat before the thunder rolled over us. The storm had arrived in earnest now, sheets of rain battering the porch. Marlene stood, smoothing her damp skirt. "Just think about what I said," she murmured, reaching for the umbrella. I walked her to the door without answering. She stepped out into the rain, disappearing into the blur of gray and wind. When I shut the door, the sound of the storm seemed to grow louder, filling the quiet she'd left behind. I leaned against the door for a long moment, my palms flat against the wood. The rain didn't stop that night, and neither did the phone calls. The bell over the door at Halpern's Grocery gave its usual cheery ring, but the welcome inside felt different. Normally, Mrs. Renfro from the bakery counter would wave first thing. Today she kept her head down, busying herself with a tray of rolls. I pushed my cart into the produce aisle, noting how the summer peaches sat in their baskets, heavy with that sweet ripeness you could smell from a few feet away. A couple of women from the quilting club passed by, smiling thinly but not slowing down. One of them, Lorraine, had always been quick with a hug. This time she only nodded. The shift was subtle but impossible to miss. Greetings that used to be warm now carried the temperature of a polite handshake. My instincts, sharpened from years in the Air Force and in medical work, told me this wasn't just coincidence. Something was moving under the surface. Near the cereal shelves, I slowed when I caught part of a conversation between two men in ball caps. "Turning her back on family," one muttered, just loud enough to carry. The other replied, "Shame. Around here, that's the worst thing you can do." They didn't look my way, but they didn't have to. The words stuck to me like burrs. At the checkout, I was placing a carton of eggs onto the belt when I heard a voice I hadn't expected. "Morning, dear." I turned to see Ivy Barker, the retired school librarian. Her presence was like finding a steady handrail in a swaying hallway. Always calm, always steady. Her eyes studied me for just a moment before she leaned in slightly. "Be careful who you trust," she murmured, sliding her own groceries forward. Then, without breaking her composed expression, she pressed a small folded note into my palm. I glanced down, feeling the faint texture of her careful handwriting through the paper. "Read it when you're alone," she added, paying the cashier as if nothing unusual had happened. By the time I finished my transaction, Ivy was already at the door, the little silver bun at the back of her head catching the light as she stepped into the August sun. Back home, I placed the grocery bags on the counter, my mind still stuck on Ivy's voice, not the words themselves but the weight behind them. I unfolded the note carefully. 3 names, each one written in the same precise, looping script I remembered from the library's sign-out sheets. Beneath them, a single sentence. Ask them about the Wednesday meeting. No greeting, no signature, just the information. Neat and deliberate, as though Ivy knew any extra word could be dangerous. The names weren't strangers. All 3 belonged to people woven into the fabric of Cedar Hollow, a church deacon, the owner of the feed store, and Mrs. Beecham, who ran the Historical Society. Different circles, but all well connected. I set the note beside my coffee mug and sat at the kitchen table, letting the pieces from the last few weeks run through my mind. Aunt Marlene's sudden visits, Dad's comments that sounded more like judgments, Mrs. Turner's friendly gossip, the way conversations lately seemed to echo the same phrases. Settle into something real, don't turn your back on family. Like a pattern in a quilt, the stitching was showing. It didn't take much to imagine those 3 names at the center of a conversation, or a meeting, where the subject was me. And if that meeting had a purpose, it was likely to make sure my story in this town was told their way, not mine. Indignation flared, but I held it in check. Years in uniform had taught me that the first strike doesn't always win the fight. The phone rang. Once, twice. I checked the caller ID. Aunt Marlene. I let it go to voicemail. 5 minutes later, it rang again. This time I didn't even look before silencing it. If they were coordinating, I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of hearing me on edge. I slipped Ivy's note into a small envelope and tucked it inside my desk drawer. Then I poured another cup of coffee and sat back, letting the quiet fill the room. Sometimes the best answer is no answer at all, at least not yet. By the end of the week, I knew where I needed to be, and exactly whose eyes I needed to look into when I asked the first question. The neon sign of Millie's Diner buzzed faintly in the August dusk, its light a wavering red glow on the cracked sidewalk. I pushed open the door, letting the cool air conditioning wash over me, carrying with it the familiar scent of frying onions and fresh coffee. To anyone watching, I was just another local stopping in for a midweek bite. I'd even brought along an old paperback to sell the idea that I was meeting a friend who might be running late. But the real reason I was here sat behind a closed door at the far end of the diner, a door with blinds drawn, the faint murmur of voices slipping through the cracks. I offered Millie a casual smile as I ordered a slice of cherry pie at the counter. "Evening," she said, pouring coffee into a mug. "You here for supper or just keeping us company?" "Little of both," I replied lightly, but my eyes flicked toward the back room. The blinds shifted slightly, as if someone had checked the front. From the corner of my vision, Caleb Rios passed by the window outside, toolbox in hand. He glanced inside and gave me a half-wave before heading on. His words from days ago, "Looks like trouble blowing in more ways than one," echoed faintly in my mind. Ivy's plan was simple. I'd serve coffee to the meeting, an errand no one would question. She'd already told Millie I was helping her out since she'd pulled something in her shoulder. A borrowed apron hung loose around my waist as I balanced the pot of coffee and a tray of mugs. When I stepped into the back room, conversation dipped just enough for me to notice before it rose again in polite tones. The smell of polished wood and old carpet filled the space, the blinds drawn tight against the fading light. Around the table sat faces I knew well, members of the church board, a couple of business owners, and 2 retired town officials. Aunt Marlene sat near the head, posture straight, her expression one of quiet authority. Mrs. Turner was there too, her hands folded neatly in her lap, eyes flicking toward me with a faintly assessing glance. I moved between them, pouring coffee, offering a smile here, a murmured evening there. Each time I stepped away, their voices dropped to a tone that was meant to exclude. I didn't force myself into their words, I just listened. At first, it sounded harmless. Updates on the church roof repairs, a fundraiser for the food pantry. But soon the language shifted like a stream darkening after rain. "We need to think about protecting community values," one man said, his voice measured, as if the phrase itself had been rehearsed. "That's right," Aunt Marlene replied smoothly, "especially with some disruptions we've been seeing lately." It wasn't long before I heard my own name. Not directly, not in a way I could call out, but close enough that there was no mistaking it. "Family disputes," someone murmured. "Divisive choices." Deputy Harold Klein, his uniform shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow, leaned forward in his chair. "Sometimes," he said, "folks just need a reminder of where their bread's buttered. Permits can take longer. Or maybe they don't get the invite to certain events until they straighten things out." I gripped the handle of the coffee pot tighter, feeling the heat through the thin fabric of my apron. Every instinct told me to speak, to push back, to call it what it was, a coordinated squeeze meant to break someone down without ever saying so outright. Instead, I kept my face still and let the words burn their way into my memory. And then I heard him. Caleb Rios. He wasn't seated at the table, but leaned casually against the wall, arms crossed. When Aunt Marlene made a thinly veiled comment about keeping standards and avoiding bad examples, Caleb nodded. "She's got a point," he said. "You let one person drift too far off from what's right, it sets the tone for everyone else." His voice wasn't cruel, but the alignment was unmistakable. The sound of it knocked the air from my lungs harder than any outright insult. Caleb had always kept to himself when it came to family politics. I'd thought, if nothing else, he'd stay neutral, but here he was, speaking the same language as the people quietly tightening the noose. Across the room, Ivy caught my eye. A quick glance toward the door was all the signal I needed. I finished pouring the last cup of coffee, set the pot down quietly, and slipped out through the side door. The night air hit me like a damp cloth, heavy, humid, and close. Cicadas sang from the dark edges of the street, and the mist from an approaching storm curled around the street lamps. I walked toward home without looking back. The low murmur of their meeting still echoed in my head, a reminder that this wasn't just about gossip. This was strategy. This was influence. This was pressure applied in ways that could change far more than reputations. They thought they were setting the rules, but if they wanted me to play their game, they were about to learn I'd been paying attention to the rules all along. The stairs to my grandmother's attic creaked the same way they had when I was a child, every groan of wood a sound I'd once found comforting. I hadn't been up here in years. Dust floated in the narrow beams of sunlight slicing through the small window, and the scent hit me immediately. Cedar from the old trunks, the faint trace of her rosewater perfume, and something dry and brittle, like the passing of decades. I came looking for quilts. The donation drive at the church was short on warm bedding, and the thought of her handiwork keeping someone else warm felt right. But as I stepped between stacks of boxes, I felt the familiar knot in my stomach, the kind that came before finding something you weren't entirely sure you wanted to see. "Mind your step, dear," Lydia Grange called from behind me. She was small, wiry, her white hair pulled back in a tidy bun, and she moved with the quick precision of someone half her age. We lifted the heavy trunk together, dust puffing out in a lazy cloud. "That old thing," she said, brushing her hands on her apron. "Your grandma used to say it held more than blankets. Made a deal once to keep the family land safe. Whole town talked about it for months." I straightened, heart catching. "What kind of deal?" Lydia's eyes flickered, the briefest hesitation before she waved a dismissive hand. "Old folks' business? Best not to dig too deep." She turned away, sorting a box of holiday ornaments like she hadn't just dropped a stone into still water. Her words clung to me as I pulled back the trunk's lid. Quilts, folded tight, patterns I recognized from childhood. The blue and white starburst, the sunflower ring. I lifted them one by one, stacking them neatly, until a hollow thump came from the trunk's base. I froze, then tapped again. Hollow. Carefully, I felt along the wood until my fingers found a thin seam. With a firm push, the false bottom shifted, revealing a shallow compartment. Inside was a single envelope, edges browned, my father's name written across the front in faded blue ink. The attic seemed to narrow around me. I slid a finger under the flap and pulled out a letter, its pages thin and fragile. The words were straightforward. A legal agreement transferring partial rights to the southern field and the creek access in exchange for ensuring continued stewardship under family interests. At the bottom were two signatures. One was my grandmother's, the other was Aunt Marlene's. I stared at it, a slow burn starting in my chest. She had signed it years ago. I recognized the handwriting from birthday cards, from the notes she used to leave me when I stayed at her house as a child. Back then, she'd been the one adult I could run to when things at home got too tense. Now, she was part of a deal that explained far too much about why certain people seemed so comfortable making decisions about my life. The words from the Wednesday meeting played back in my mind. Talk of zoning, of influence, of keeping things in the right hands. Maybe this agreement was the root of all of it, the unspoken leverage they'd been holding. I tucked the letter into the inside pocket of my jacket, the paper warm against my side from the heat of my palm. Lydia glanced over from her box, but said nothing. By the time I climbed down from the attic, my resolve was set. If she'd signed away our future once, I needed to know what she was willing to do next. The phone call lasted all of 20 seconds. "Can you meet me at the cafe this morning?" I asked, my voice flat, clipped at the edges. Aunt Marlene didn't answer right away. I could almost hear the hesitation building in that silence. "What time?" she finally said. 7. Another pause. Then a sigh. "Fine." By the time I arrived at Main Street Cafe, the air still carried the cool of early morning, the street lamps blinking out one by one. Inside, the warm, heavy scent of coffee wrapped around me like an unwelcome shawl. The bell above the door chimed as I stepped in, drawing a quick glance from the few early customers. She was already there, back straight in a corner booth, her handbag perched beside her like an obedient pet. Her coat was buttoned to the neck despite the indoor heat. I slid into the seat opposite her, placing the worn, yellowed envelope between us without a word. Her hand twitched toward it, then stopped mid-air. Instead, she reached for her mug and took a slow sip. "Coffee's strong today," she said, her tone deliberately casual. I didn't smile. "Read it." She didn't, at least not right away. Instead, she looked past me toward the counter, as if considering whether to ask for more cream. "You've been in the attic," she said finally. "I have," I replied. And her eyes narrowed. "Then you already know why I did it." I leaned forward, elbows on the table. "I know what you say you did. I don't know why it had to be done in secret, why I had to find out in a trunk instead of from you." She set the mug down with more force than necessary. "Your father would have sold the land before you graduated high school. He was in debt, desperate and dangerous with a quick dollar. I did what needed to be done to keep the family from losing everything." I let her words hang for a moment, the clink of dishes from the kitchen filling the space between us. "And you couldn't tell me? Not once in all these years?" "You were a child," she said, almost spitting the word. "And then you were away, building your life. What good would it have done for you to carry that weight?" My jaw tightened. "You mean what good would it have done for me to know the truth?" She didn't deny it. Instead, she looked down at the envelope, fingers tracing the edge without opening it. "There's more you don't know." That was when she told me about the other clause, the one that restricted my inheritance and kept certain family members from having legal reason to see me. It wasn't just about the land. It was about keeping me away from people she said wouldn't be good for you. It all clicked. The empty chairs at Christmas, the unreturned letters, the cousins who faded into silence. Years of absence explained in one neat, brutal sentence. My voice cracked despite myself. "You didn't just protect me from him, Marlene. You cut me off from everyone else." She looked at me then, her expression softer but no less firm. "You don't have to thank me." I pushed back from the table, my coffee still untouched. The bell above the cafe door rang out as I left, sharp and final. In my bag, the letter felt heavier than when I'd found it. Not just paper, but the weight of a story rewritten without my consent. If my aunt had rewritten my story once, I wasn't going to let her hold the pen again. The sun had barely cleared the rooftops when I found myself back at the kitchen table, the same letter from the attic lying beside a pad of paper. Last night's coffee sat untouched, bitter and cold, but I didn't care about the taste. My pen hovered over the page as I drew 2 columns, what I knew and what I still needed to prove. Words spoken over coffee could be denied. But paper had a way of holding the truth hostage until you were ready to face it. By the time I pushed back my chair, my decision was made. If there was more to the story, it would be written down somewhere, and I intended to find it. The attic greeted me with the same musty breath of cedar, dust, and faded perfume. I'd brought gloves this time, and a flashlight to cut through the dimness. I wasn't here for sentiment. I was hunting for tax documents, trust deeds, anything that might back Aunt Marlene into a corner. Near the far wall, behind a stack of quilt boxes, I spotted a burlap flour sack that didn't belong. The knot in its twine was old but loose, and inside was a cracked leather ledger, its cover worn smooth from years of handling. I knelt on the plank floor and opened it. The handwriting was tight and deliberate, each page split into columns for dates, amounts, and initials. In the margins, neat notes: tuition, RX, ER copay, car dien pimped. I flipped page after page, my stomach tightening. These weren't random acts of kindness. This was a system. Someone had been tracking me, tracking my life, down to the bills I thought I'd covered on my own. It took half an hour before I saw the pattern. The initials PH appeared beside the largest sums. The EMT training fee, the down payment for my first car, the deposit on the apartment above the old hardware store. Smaller entries were tagged church fund or community trust, but PH loomed like a watermark over my adult life. I froze, the flashlight beam trembling in my hand. Philip Hartley. The name surfaced like a splinter I thought had worked its way out years ago. He'd been at every church picnic, every town parade when I was a kid, always with a polite smile that didn't reach his eyes. My father's voice when he spoke of Hartley had been tight, resentful, and I'd learned to avoid the man on instinct alone. And yet, here he was, on paper, under my skin. The Polk County Records Office smelled faintly of old paper and ozone from the copier. I slid my request slip to the clerk, who gave me a nod and disappeared into the stacks. When she returned, her arms were full of manila folders stamped with dates older than I was. We went through parcel histories, trust abstracts, and lien records, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Aunt Marlene's name was conspicuously absent from the big transactions. Instead, the dispersor's name showed up again and again. The clerk flipped one folder closed and chuckled softly. Old Mr. Hartley kept half this county afloat, quietly, of course. So it hadn't been luck that the scholarship committee found me. It hadn't been an anonymous donor who covered my emergency medical bills after that training accident, and the down payment on my first car. Not the result of frugal saving like I'd told myself. It had been Hartley, writing checks from the shadows. Gratitude twisted into something sour. Every milestone I'd believed I'd earned now had a string attached, and I couldn't see where it ended. I thanked the clerk, gathered the certified copies, and stepped out into the bright, cold air. The paper was stiff in my hand, but it felt heavier than the ledger I'd found in the attic. If Philip Hartley had been writing checks in my name all these years, it was time I found out what else he'd signed for. The morning mist hung low over the fields as I steered my truck along the winding county road toward the edge of Cedar Ridge. The pavement narrowed, curling through stands of maple and oak, their leaves already dusted with early autumn gold. I hadn't been down this way in years, not since before I learned how silence could stretch across decades. Every mile marker felt like a pin pushing into a map of my own childhood. The weathered feed store sign, the low wooden bridge over Hollow Creek where my mother once held my hand and told me not to lean too far. I rehearsed my questions in my head, knowing they'd probably scatter the second I saw him. How many years had it been? Long enough that the thought of Philip Hartley was more a shape in my memory than a man. But the ledger from the attic, the county clerk's confirmation, and those initials had drawn me here. The gravel crunching under my tires was the first sound he would have heard before I even got out of the cab. The front gate of Hartley Farm stood ajar. Beyond it, the wide yard was ringed by split-rail fencing, the boards darkened from rain and time. A corral sat off to the left, and that's where I saw him. Philip Hartley, older but still upright, a sturdy figure in a canvas jacket, his hair more silver than the last time I remembered it. He was working a bay horse, murmuring in low tones I couldn't make out, adjusting the saddle with slow, practiced hands. When he looked up, his eyes narrowed just slightly. Not in suspicion exactly, but like he'd been expecting someone and wasn't sure whether he wanted it to be me. "Didn't think I'd see you here," he said, voice carrying over the crisp air. "Guess I didn't either," I answered. It was easier to match his guarded tone than to show the weight in my chest. Inside the farmhouse kitchen, the air was warmer, heavy with the smell of strong coffee and wood smoke. The table between us was scarred with knife marks, its checkered cloth faded to a pale pink. I stayed standing for a moment, not wanting to set my bag down, not wanting to seem too settled. "I suppose you've come with questions," Philip said, pouring himself a mug. He didn't offer me one. Instead of answering, I pulled the folded ledger page from my jacket pocket and set it on the table. He glanced at it but didn't touch it. "You found it then," he said after a pause, not asking. I held his gaze. "You've been paying for things. My tuition, my car, hospital bills. Why?" His eyes shifted toward the window where the pasture stretched out under the pale sun. "Because I promised your mother I would." The words landed heavier than I'd expected. He reached into the pocket of his jacket, pulled out a small, sealed envelope, and placed it on the table with deliberate care. "She wrote this before she died. Told me to keep it until you were old enough to understand. I thought maybe that day had already come, but I guess you had to find your way here first." We went out to the barn loft to look for some old tax receipts he said might help fill in the blanks. The air smelled of hay and dust, the boards creaking under our steps. In a far corner, stacked behind a row of wooden crates, I found a plain, unmarked cardboard box. Inside were bundles of letters, not from him to my mother, but between Philip and someone else. I didn't recognize the handwriting at first, but the tone in the words was unmistakable, clipped, controlling, always framing me as ungrateful or too busy to visit. The more I read, the more it became clear. Whoever wrote these had kept us apart, feeding each of us a version of the other that was easier to resent than to understand. "Who was sending these?" I asked, my voice tighter than I meant. Philip didn't answer right away, just took one from my hand and turned it over, as if seeing it for the first time. "Someone who thought they were protecting you," he said finally, "or protecting themselves." Back in the kitchen, Philip leaned against the counter, the light from the small window cutting a sharp line across his face. "I've done what I could. But if you want me out of your life, I'll step away now," he said. "If you want to try and start something, I'll be here, on your terms." I didn't answer. My eyes kept dropping to the envelope from my mother, still on the table where he'd left it. I picked it up, its paper warm from the sunlight spilling in. When I walked out to my truck, the wind had picked up, carrying the faint smell of hay and wood smoke with me. I set the envelope on the passenger seat, my fingers resting on it for a long moment before I turned the key in the ignition. I drove away from Hartley Farm with the uneasy sense that opening it would change everything, again. The envelope sat in the middle of my kitchen table like a weight I didn't remember carrying in. The oak surface was scarred from years of coffee mugs and grocery lists, but tonight it felt almost new, foreign, because of what rested on it. Beside it, my car keys and a half-empty glass of water looked like props in someone else's scene. The late evening light stretched across the wood in a thin gold band, brushing the edge of the paper, but never quite touching it. "When you're ready," Philip had said, his voice low, his eyes fixed on mine like he could will me into the moment. I wasn't ready. Not when he handed it to me in that farmhouse kitchen. Not now, with the air in here holding the last traces of sun-warmed dust from the gravel road home. I pulled out a chair, sat down, and rested my hands on either side of the envelope. The temptation to tear it open was as sharp as the fear of what would spill out if I did. I stood instead, filled the kettle, lit the burner, watched the water quiver, then roll into a boil. These little rituals had always been my anchor, measuring tea leaves, letting steam soften my face, waiting for the click of ceramic against ceramic as I set the mug down. If I kept my hands busy, maybe my head would find the right place to start. But the past is rude. It pushes in where it's not invited. A whiff of lilac from the soap on the windowsill took me straight back to my mother's arms, damp from dishwater, pulling me in after I'd scraped a knee. The low hum of the fridge found its echo in the buzz of the box fan she used to wedge in the apartment window every summer in St. Louis. I wrapped both hands around my mug and came back to the table. The envelope waited. I ran my thumb along the seam, testing it. It held. And suddenly I was there again, the last time I'd visited her in that narrow apartment. The curtains were half drawn against a bright afternoon, and the tiny kitchen smelled faintly of fried okra. A gospel station played low on the radio, the kind of music she only put on when she was trying to keep her own thoughts from getting too loud. "Someday," she'd said, her voice soft enough to make me lean closer, "there are things you'll need to know." The look in her eyes told me she'd decided that someday wasn't yet. Before I could ask, the neighbor knocked, loud, careless, and whatever she'd been about to tell me evaporated between us. Back in the present, the storm rolled in fast. The screen door rattled, the first drops pattering against the porch roof. I slid a butter knife under the flap of the envelope. The fibers gave way with a whisper, parting just enough for me to see the slant of her handwriting. My breath caught. It was hers, unmistakably hers. But the letters wavered, the loops uncertain. I'd seen her hand confident and fluid for decades. This was different. I pulled the page free just far enough to read the first lines. It began with the kind of greeting only she would use, half a joke, half a benediction, followed by a line about the brave heart she had always insisted I carried. And then, right there in the middle of an otherwise ordinary sentence, it was waiting for me. A phrase from my childhood. A phrase no one else could possibly know. "The tulips are leaning," it said. When I was little, that had been our code for someone is listening. She'd use it on the phone when she didn't want to speak freely, her voice light as if she were talking about flowers instead of danger. My stomach dropped. The shaky handwriting. The coded signal. This letter hadn't been written in peace. I set the mug down and walked to the porch. Rain drummed the roof, spilling over the gutters, the smell of wet earth curling into the room behind me. The paper in my hand felt warmer than it should, like it carried her pulse. I folded it once, twice, slid it back into the envelope. I wasn't ready to read the rest. Not until I knew who had been standing over her shoulder. The morning air was crisp, the kind that cut clean through your thoughts and left only the sharp edges. I arrived at town hall an hour early, my boots clicking against the varnished wood floor. The room smelled faintly of lemon oil and dust. Rows of folding chairs stood in neat lines, waiting for the crowd that would soon fill them. In my bag, tucked into a stiff plastic sleeve, was my mother's letter, the one I'd carried for 3 weeks, reading and rereading until the words had etched themselves behind my eyelids. Today it would stop being a private burden and become a public weapon. I had arranged for 2 reporters from the Cedar Ridge Chronicle, a freelance photographer, and a pair of witnesses who owed me nothing but the truth. I set my bag on the table at the front and began rehearsing the cadence in my head. Not just the words, but the pauses, the way each sentence would land. This wasn't just about Philip Hartley, it was about ending a shadow that had hung over my family for decades. By the time the hall filled, the air was thick with body heat and anticipation. Mayor Cooper sat stiffly near the front, his eyes avoiding mine. Philip was 2 rows back, posture rigid, pen tapping against his notebook. He didn't know exactly what I had, but he knew enough to be nervous. I stepped to the microphone. "My name is," I began, letting the weight of my voice settle over the room. I started with a few facts everyone knew. My mother's years as a nurse, the way she gave more than she had, the day she died. Then, without changing my tone, I wove in the phrase from her letter. "The tulips are leaning." A ripple passed through the crowd. My eyes stayed on Philip. His pen stopped mid-tap. For the briefest second, his gaze met mine, and something in it faltered. A crack in his practiced stillness. That was all the confirmation I needed. I reached into my bag and drew out a photocopy of the letter, holding it high so the front row could see. The paper was creased and slightly yellowed, my mother's handwriting slanting across the page. "This letter," I said, "was written in the final weeks of my mother's life. In it, she warns me, in a way only I would understand, that she was not alone when she wrote it." I motioned to the side, and Mrs. Ellen Draper, my mother's former neighbor, stepped forward. She spoke clearly, recounting how she'd seen a man in a dark suit leaving my mother's apartment the day the letter was mailed. Next came Carl Redden, a retired city clerk, who testified that certain permits and housing requests in my mother's name had been altered under pressure from Philip's office. The room was no longer quiet. Murmurs rose, chairs scraped, people shifted forward to hear more. I turned back to Philip. "I am calling for your resignation from the town council, effective immediately," I said. "And I am calling on Mayor Cooper to explain his role in allowing this to happen under his watch." Philip leaned forward, mouth opening to speak, but I cut him off. "Before you answer, you should know I have already filed legal motions with the county court. As of this morning, your assets are frozen pending investigation into misuse of public and private funds." For a heartbeat, the room held its breath. Then the sound came. A collective gasp, a few cheers, the click of camera shutters snapping in rapid succession. Philip's jaw tightened. A bead of sweat traced down his temple. For the first time since I'd known him, his composure cracked. The rest unfolded quickly. The mayor stumbled through a statement about respecting due process. A reporter shouted questions from the back. Philip pushed his chair back with a screech and walked out without another word. I stayed until the meeting adjourned, then stepped into the autumn sunlight outside the courthouse. The press swarmed me, microphones and cameras pressing close. My mother's voice was almost silenced, I said, meeting their eyes one by one. Today it spoke louder than ever. I didn't wait for follow-up questions. I walked down the steps, the hum of conversation and the staccato of camera shutters chasing me to the curb. That evening, I drove to the bank. The safety deposit room was cool and quiet, the air faintly metallic. I opened the narrow drawer and slid the original letter inside, resting it atop a single manila folder. It no longer felt like a weight I had to carry everywhere. It felt like a cornerstone, proof that truth, once dragged into the light, could stand on its own. I closed the drawer, turned the key, and left without looking back. Looking back, I've learned that truth doesn't always roar. It often starts as a whisper we're too afraid to hear. My mother's letter taught me that silence can protect, but it can also imprison. Sometimes you have to gather every ounce of courage and step into the light, even if your voice shakes. Standing up isn't just about clearing your own name, it's about making sure no one else is silenced the same way. If you take anything from my story, let it be this. Do not underestimate the power of persistence and the weight of your own voice. Your story matters, and telling it might be the key that frees someone else. Now, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever faced a moment when speaking up felt impossible, yet you knew you had to? Share your thoughts in the comments. If this story touched your heart, drop a 1 below or tell me where you're watching from. And if it didn't resonate, let me know why. Your voice matters here too. If you enjoyed this video and want more real stories that inspire, challenge, and connect us, hit that subscribe button now so you won't miss the next chapter.